Every evening just before sunset, a lonely melody drifted across the hills. The sound came from a small wooden flute, and every evening without fail a magnificent black horse would stop, lift its head and listen. No matter how far away it was, the horse always came running. The villagers believed the horse simply loved the music. They were wrong. The horse wasn't following the melody. It was following the only voice its master had ever possessed. His name was Oliver, and in all his 18 years, he had never spoken a single word. Some children laughed at him. Others pretended he didn't exist. When strangers asked him questions, he could only lower his eyes and smile with quiet embarrassment. But silence never made him bitter, because every afternoon someone was always waiting for him. At the edge of the valley stood a beautiful black horse. The moment Oliver appeared, the horse walked toward him as if greeting an old friend. Oliver would gently place his forehead against the horse's neck. Neither of them made a sound. They didn't need to. Some friendships are spoken without words. When Oliver smiled, the horse softly breathed against his shoulder. When Oliver cried, the horse never left his side. To everyone else it was just a horse, but to Oliver it was the only soul who had never asked why he couldn't speak. One spring morning, Oliver carved a tiny flute from an old apple tree branch. The first note was rough, the second was softer. By the third, the black horse closed its eyes and quietly walked toward him. From that day they no longer needed words. The flute became their language. Neither of them could have imagined that one day that little wooden flute would decide between life and death. As the years passed, Oliver grew taller, and so did the black horse. The villagers called him Shadow. His coat was as dark as a moonless night, but between his eyes was a single white mark shaped like a falling star. Every morning before sunrise, Oliver opened the stable door. Shadow was already waiting. The horse would gently lower his head until it rested against the boy's shoulder. It became their morning ritual. They crossed the hills together, walked beside rivers, climbed quiet trails where no one else ever went. Oliver never felt different when Shadow was beside him. He never needed to explain his silence. The horse understood everything through a single look or the smallest touch. Sometimes Oliver would sit beneath an old oak tree and play his little wooden flute. The melody was simple, but whenever the wind carried it across the valley, Shadow would stop whatever he was doing and run. Always, without hesitation. The villagers began to notice. Some smiled. Others whispered that there was something magical about the boy and his horse. But Oliver never believed in magic. He believed in love. One cold evening his mother began coughing so hard she could barely breathe. Days passed. The fever only grew worse. The village doctor looked at Oliver with sorrow and quietly wrote the name of a medicine his mother desperately needed. "It's expensive," he whispered. Oliver looked around their tiny home. There was almost nothing left. An old table, a warm blanket, a few cooking pots. Nothing worth selling. Nothing except one thing. Outside, Shadow stood peacefully waiting, unaware that before the next sunrise, everything would change. Oliver didn't sleep that night. He sat inside the stable beside Shadow. The lantern burned low. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Oliver rested his forehead against Shadow's neck. He closed his eyes. If he had been able to speak, there were 1,000 things he would have said. Instead, he simply held his friend a little tighter. The next morning, a wealthy landowner arrived. He had heard about the magnificent black horse. He offered more money than Oliver had ever seen. Oliver never looked at the coins. His eyes never left Shadow. Slowly he nodded. Not because he wanted to, because he had no other choice. His mother's life was worth more than his own happiness. The rope was placed around Shadow's neck. The horse took a few steps, then stopped. He turned and looked at Oliver. Not once, not twice, again and again, as if asking, "Why aren't you coming?" Oliver's hands began to tremble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the little wooden flute. For a moment he almost raised it to his lips. One note was enough. Shadow would break free and come back. Oliver knew it, but he also knew what would happen next. The buyers would chase him. They would beat him. Perhaps they would even take Shadow away forever. So for the first time since carving that little flute, Oliver did the hardest thing he had ever done. He lowered it without playing a single note. Tears rolled silently down his face. Shadow disappeared beyond the hill. The valley had never felt so quiet. That evening, for the first time since they had met, the wind carried no melody. And somewhere far away a lonely black horse lifted his head, searching for a song that never came. 2 winters passed. Oliver's mother recovered. Every day he thanked God for giving her another chance. But every evening, when the sun began to disappear, his hand would quietly touch the little wooden flute, hanging around his neck. He never played it. Some memories are too painful to awaken. One freezing afternoon, Oliver climbed into the mountains to gather firewood. Dark clouds covered the sky. The wind grew stronger. Snow began to fall. On his way home, his foot slipped. The frozen ground gave way beneath him. Oliver tumbled down a steep ravine. Pain shot through his leg. He tried to stand. He couldn't. He looked toward the sky. No one could hear him. Even if they could, he had never been able to call for help. The snow fell harder. The cold grew heavier. Oliver closed his eyes. Then his trembling hand touched the wooden flute. For a long moment he simply held it. If he played that melody, Shadow would come. But after all these years, would he still remember? Oliver took one slow breath, and for the first time since saying goodbye, he lifted the flute to his lips. One fragile note rose into the winter wind, then another, and another. Far away inside a large stable, a magnificent black horse suddenly raised his head. His ears stood still. His heart had recognized a voice the world could never replace. With one powerful pull, Shadow broke free. Ignoring every shout behind him, he raced through fields, across rivers, and into the snowstorm. Minutes later, Oliver heard a familiar sound. Hoofbeats. Closer, closer. He opened his tired eyes. There, through the swirling snow, stood Shadow. The horse gently lowered his head as if to say, "I'm here." With the last of his strength, Oliver wrapped his arms around his old friend. Shadow knelt just enough for Oliver to climb onto his back. Step by step through the blizzard, the faithful horse carried him home. The wealthy landowner who had followed the tracks stood speechless. He had bought a horse, but he had never owned its heart. Quietly he removed the reins from Shadow's neck and placed them into Oliver's hands. "I paid for his body, but loyalty can never be bought." Oliver's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't say thank you. He never could. Instead, he gently rested his forehead against Shadow's. The horse closed his eyes. Sometimes the deepest love is never spoken. It is simply understood. Before we close tonight's story, let me ask you one question. Who has stood beside you without asking for anything in return? If someone came to your mind, don't wait to let them know what they mean to you. Until next time, keep your light alive.